Now, you're not going to have a country that can make these kind of rules work if you haven't got men that have learned to tell human rights from a punch in the nose.
That's good for a headline.
It's a funny thing about men. They all start life being boys. I was a bit surprised some of these senators are boys weren't. And that's why it seemed like a pretty good idea to me to get boys out of crowded cities and stuffy basements for a couple of months out of the year and build their bodies and minds for man-sized jobs, because those boys are going to be behind these desks some of these days. It seemed like a pretty good idea. Getting boys from all over the country, boys of all nationalities and ways of living, getting them together. Let them find out what makes different people tick the way they do. Because I wouldn't give you 2 cents for all your fancy rules if behind them they didn't have a little bit of plain, ordinary, everyday kindness. And a little looking out for the other fellow, too.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Not Content Podcast as part of the From the Q Podcasting Network. My name is Jerome Cuson. As always, we are continuing our discussion of important anniversaries, and we are pairing with a wrestling match, of course, being the first Tuesday of the month. Wouldn't you know, it's Election Day, so fittingly, we are going to discuss Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and we are pairing it with a rather infamous wrestling match that took place in D.C., that, of course, being Bret Hart versus Bill Goldberg, the 25th anniversary of Starrcade 99. Make your own connections between Jefferson Smith and Bret Hart. I beg you. Please leave a 4 or 5 star review on Apple or Spotify to get those algorithms going. Please like and subscribe to us on YouTube. My co-host, as always, is Brian. Brian, all I can say is it is Election Day, as many people are likely listening to this. And we have not reviewed any movies from 1939 thus far. I don't believe we've reviewed any 1939 movies, period. And it is, of course, the 85th anniversary of one of the greatest movie years of all time. 1939 is right up there. We are going to be looking at 4 absolute classics this month. And we are starting with Frank Capra and Jimmy Stewart's second of 3 collaborations, this being Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Brian, I just have to ask you right off the bat, how are you feeling about Jefferson Smith after he reads about himself in the newspaper and just starts assaulting journalists on the streets of D.C.?
I couldn't help but think of Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back. I mean, come on. That's the only movie I feel where it's like, let's punch the people in the face of those assholes on social media who spew out this bullshit and have probably never been punched in the face themselves. That's the vibe I was getting, except these newspaper people seem like they've been punched in the face before. And being in that time period wouldn't surprise me, considering all the shit they've gone through, all the nonsense they were putting in the papers at the time, and especially in this movie, they seem to be spewing bullshit throughout the whole thing 24/7. So I guess nothing's changed. That's the whole conclusion I've come to about this movie by the end of it. I was like, nothing has changed, and in many ways, this is like a slow burn horror movie in reality, because this is horrific behind the scenes look at
So let me get this
politics.
straight, Brian. You are telling me that all of these senators that are currently in the Senate are corrupt. You are saying that all of the Washington, D.C. press are a bunch of sycophants who are more interested in a story than anything else. You're telling me that that is all currently how we are operating right now.
Yes, and this is all 85 years later from this movie.
I mean, I think
God.
here's my thing. I think people are very nostalgic for a specific time when things weren't so political and when things weren't so cynical. And this movie is a hard reality check because, I mean, at this point in 1939, you're talking about, you know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who has the reputation of being one of the greatest presidents of all time. Like, he is in office at this point. And look, I don't know how true this movie actually is, but there has to be a lot of elements of truth. I mean, Frank Capra, who is admittedly a conservative, who was a Republican, but not like the lunatic Republican fringe that you're talking about now. You're talking about, I guess, for lack of a better term, a more normalized version of the Republican Party at that time. But clearly, there has to be some truth reflected in what he was saying, because I mean, again, just the way that the press are portrayed, it feels too close to home in so many ways, and it feels like, as you stated, like the mood never changes. Like these are I mean, things are undoubtedly worse, but in many ways, we have been dealing with this throughout all of history. This is not a new thing. The corruption of Washington, the bureaucracy, just everything is really laid out. And I think Frank Capra does an excellent job. I mean, this is a very exposition heavy movie, but I give him credit for laying it out so that audiences can go in and actually understand what is going on. And I think that, he does about as good of a job as kind of explaining and just making everything clear, like just the steps that need to be taken for a bill, the rules of the filibuster. Like, I think it all feels pretty real. And I mean, obviously there is the kind of the fairy tale ending to it, but that's all Frank Capra movies. So you're going to get that. But I mean, this is a pretty dark movie, man. That's all I could say.
It's there's this trope in movies. I can't think of any specific one right now, but it's this idea that you bring in this naive new person to the table, to the leadership table, to management or whatever, and they have these ideals of what they want to do, and all of a sudden they're going to get this reality check by the management team around them that's not how things go. And that's exactly what this was. And you can't help but think of, like, I don't know, for some reason I thought of AOC, right? Like just this idea that she's so like hard, stubborn, driven, and like wants to change things, and that's kind of the vibe I got from like James Stewart in this, Jefferson Smith.
Well, the thing is that AOC has been consumed by the system, so I mean, I understand that example, and I was actually going to reference her a little bit later, but I mean, let's be honest, she is very much a mainstream Democrat at this point.
Exactly, and I was just kind of thinking, like, that's kind of what happens when these young people go into politics and they just have these reality checks, right? And then that's kind of like a thing with corporations going up the corporate ladder, thinking you can do something about the company and help the workers, but in reality, you're just going to be another like pawn. And that's what they were telling him. Just follow everything. Everything we tell you. Just follow this. You'll be a senator forever. Don't worry about it. And he was like, "What?" Like he couldn't believe. Jefferson Smith could not believe that like this system was built in place already for him, and there's no like necessarily ideas about free ideas or whatever, like this idea of a dam being built that no one knew about. Like somehow no one knew about this dam being built for the last 2 years. I don't know. And by the end of it, I was thinking, like, can't we just like move the camp? Like, can't we have both? Like, let's have the dam and the camp. Like, why can't we just have both? But that wasn't like they didn't even make that an issue. They just said we're gonna have one or the other, and that was the main issue. We're either gonna have a dam in the park, or we're not gonna have a dam in the park.
I mean, I think it's a principle thing. That's how I see it. It's kind of a principle thing.
That's how I see it too. But I kept thinking, like, come on, we could easily compromise this. But again, this is already a 2-hour movie in 1939. Like, that's asking a lot for an audience, considering a lot of runtimes this time around in this era. Were 90 minutes. But then 1939 is kind of an outlier because this is also the same year as Gone with the Wind, which is 3 hours, which is kind of unheard of for the time. But yeah, I think this 2-hour runtime was kind of like, whoa, this is a lot for 1939. But at the same time, it feels so modern, and it feels like, I don't know, like it was written today. Like it feels like an Adam McKay kind of movie as well. Like this idea of like political satire.
I could definitely see that. I mean, it's definitely, I think in some ways it's more subtle, but I think in other ways it's a big jackhammer. So, I mean, look, I have very mixed feelings on Adam McKay and what he has done to this kind of movie. I think The Big Short was really good, but I think that there have been there's been a lot of issues ever since that haven't really. I think there's some movies that have kind of done something similar, and they just haven't worked. But I think this movie works. I mean, I think this is probably one of Jimmy Stewart's best performances. And you could probably say that, quite frankly, about a lot of movies in this era. But I think that what he does here, I think Frank Capra consistently gets the best out of him. And he did win a year later for The Philadelphia Story, but I feel like this is a far superior performance compared to Philadelphia Story.
Well, if you look at the physical like performance of this, when he's doing the filibuster, the poor guy, like, you can't sit, and he's doing these lines of dialogue, and he's got like so many pages. He's like, he's keeling over, but he's not sitting down. You know what I mean? He's trying to be in the in the safe zone, and he's just like, you can tell like the performance is getting to him because that filibuster scene is so long, and he's got to stand there the whole time at that desk. But credit to Jimmy Stewart for like carrying that whole third act. It was just incredible. Yes, it does have the sappy happy ending where the guy out of nowhere, Claude Rains, we'll talk about him in a sec, comes out of nowhere and says, I made him, I'm guilty. He's innocent. We planted evidence on him, blah, blah, blah. I got to kill myself. That was kind of random, not going to lie. But at the same time, it's 1939. They got to do the happy ending out of nowhere. Because if this came out today, Jimmy Stewart would have passed out on the Senate floor like usual, but he would have died on the Senate floor, dying for his cause, and no one would have cared. Most of the people in the Senate would probably not even cared. And I think that's the darker ending you would get today. But, this is Frank Capra. We know that he's this idealist with all his movies. You'll get more of that in Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. But, this movie is just all Jimmy Stewart. But at the same time, you look at Claude Rains, and he's doing work, man, in the background. I didn't even think of this, but with the makeup that he's wearing, because he's obviously aged him for this movie, for the makeup for the time looked great, because he just looked like this older dude, but he was really like in his 40s at the time. And the fact that like this made me think of Robert Downey Jr. in Oppenheimer, where it's like I think Robert Downey Jr. just channeled this energy from this role of Senator Joseph Payne, and like got the makeup, the darker hair. Dude, that we're going to shoot in black and white in that last third act, where it's just all about political scheming. And what is this a character about? Political scheming. So it just feels like Robert Downey Jr. looked at this Claude Rains role and just kind of took from that. And I don't know if there's evidence for that at all, but it just seems so much like it with the makeup, the character work, the similarities between the two characters, the two senators. I don't know, man, but I think Robert Downey Jr. owes a lot to Claude Rains for winning that Oscar at Oppenheimer, because it's just that similar role. And Claude Rains, man, my goodness. I was texting Jerome, but I don't know, one of the top 5 actors of all time. Like, in terms of just talent.
Claude Rains is really good.
Not drawing money, but just talent-wise, my goodness. Watch The Invisible Man. That's all I got to say. It's just tremendous.
He's a really good supporting actor. I think he's really good in this. Casablanca, Invisible Man. He's just consistently one of those guys.
Robin Hood. I love him in Robin Hood, too. God, I love that Robin Hood.
I would say that he is that guy. I think that he kind of fits in because he is almost never the lead in any movie. And even in this movie, I would say he is either probably number 3 or 4 on the call sheet. But I think that he adds something to every movie. He is always playing in a morally gray area, seemingly. And that is what he excels at. And that's what he's good at. And I think you get that really well represented. The stuff with Jimmy Stewart and Jean Arthur, I think it's very much a mixed bag. I think Jean Arthur is giving a good performance, but it's weird to me. Like, these two were in a Frank Capra movie before You Can't Take It With You, and now they're reunited. And it just doesn't feel like the chemistry is there. Like, I don't think their scenes are necessarily bad together, but like with Donna Reed and Jimmy Stewart, like, you felt the chemistry. I think when we watch Only Angels Have Wings, you're definitely going to feel the chemistry. I wasn't really feeling it with these two.
No, there's more chemistry with that older guy, right? That that newspaper guy that they keep talking about getting married, right? They have more chemistry. It's weird because I thought they were legit going to get married.
I love that actor, whose name I'm going to get in just a moment. I love.
He's in A Wonderful Life too.
Alcoholic.
Yeah, and he's in It's a Wonderful Life.
And he is always playing an alcoholic. And it's Thomas Mitchell, and he is absolutely another one of those guys. Uncle Billy in this. He's also in Gone with the Wind. And he's in Stagecoach. So he will be. We could talk about him literally for like 3 movies. We are not discussing Gone with the Wind, but we will be revisiting him when we talk about Stagecoach.
Yeah, it just seems like they were setting something up because they had this, I don't know. At first I thought it was a throwaway scene when they had that scene at the dinner table and they were getting drunk and talking about getting married. But then it kept going and going, and I was like, I guess they're going to get married. And this is kind of like this background romance story. But then at the end of the movie, she writes this letter to Jimmy Stewart and says, I love you. And I'm like, bro, you only knew her for like 3 days. We're doing this? So that was just like, oh, man. So the poor guy had her in the bag and just lost her like that. And truly, they probably deserve to be.
He is a drunk. To be fair, he is a drunk.
They're both drunks, but they're both happy drunks, and they really click. And I think they had more chemistry.
This is when alcoholism is okay. That's the general rule. Alcoholism is okay.
When it was needed for recording Senate floor hearings. So,
so Brian, how did you feel about the exposition? Did you feel like it was clunky? Because there's a lot of those moments where
I felt like this is a great movie to teach in U.S. history. Like, I feel like if you need a crash course on some of these ideas of how Senate bills go through and whatnot, like we've all had those lessons in U.S. history class, but it doesn't necessarily stick sometimes. But in this case, that crash course that she gives Jimmy Stewart in the office was like, dude, this is perfect. Like, this is a total teaching moment right here, because everything she's saying is accurate, and it's still, I think, accurate today in terms of the law, in terms of where a bill stands and getting to the filibuster point and voting and committees and all that thing, voting on your bill. So I think, in terms of that was really good. Everything else was good. I think we needed more background on this. I don't know how they planted all the evidence on him. We'll get to that. So basically, he wants to open this camp for Boy Scouts, and he's making this bill, and he claims that we can open up on this land, but somehow they switched it up on him where it made it seem like he owned the land and he was just trying to make profit, and they wanted to kick him out of the Senate. But, I want to know, like, how did they plant all that evidence on him? Because there's all these eyewitnesses, and they just said, oh, yeah, that's the guy. There's his signature. There's the guy. And we never
You see, the Senate is corrupt, Brian, and that is why everything is allowed to go down, because it's so damn corrupt.
I just wanted to see the corruption in physical form. It's just like, wait a minute, you're planting evidence? How did this happen? When did this happen?
I think the issue is it's 1939 and they can't go there. I think this movie was attacked for being anti-communist anyway. So if at this point they would just be piling on. And it's amazing to me that for somebody who, again, was a Republican on multiple occasions, It's a Wonderful Life was also included. Frank Capra has been accused of being a communist. It's really weird.
Well, I think the Republican Party's got its own split going on right now, so that kind of reflects that differential ideas. You know what I mean? That different idealism in terms of the Republican Party right now between MAGA and non-MAGA traditional Republicans. I think that's where Frank Capra comes from, the traditional side. So that's,
I don't even
Schwarzenegger.
think Frank Capra would not recognize, even by the time you get to the Reagan Republicans. I think he is just, it's very different. Frank Capra would absolutely be a Democrat right now. There is no doubt in my mind, just based on even where the Democratic Party is headed. But we digress. I think that just, again, a lot of really great performances across the board. I think this is a movie with a lot of really interesting dynamics at play, and some really neat editing as well. What did you think of the montage at the beginning where Jimmy Stewart's kind of going around D.C. and marveling at the statues and the Capitol Dome and just being at his country?
Yeah, that's that naivete, right? That's what I'm talking about. Whenever you got this new person with all these ideals coming in, and they're just like starstruck at like all these monuments to all his idols. So I thought that was really cool, because it's like he's going to get this reality check that some of these people that he looked up to may have not been so honest, like Honest Abe, right? That's kind of what I think that's what they're leaning towards, obviously, when he's going through all these different statues and stuff, and just he's getting shivers just looking at, the Abraham Lincoln statue. So I thought that was a really cool moment, because it's almost as if you see him as that little boy that they describe him being in the first half of the movie until he kind of mans up. So I thought that was a really good, foretelling of what's to come, kind of him like idolizing all these people. And other things that I want to point out is like, this kid got punched in the face by this adult, and I couldn't stop laughing for a good 2 minutes. I know that's bad, but there's this montage in the where like they got the newspapers fighting each other, where it's like, the regular newspapers are going against Jefferson, and then the child newspapers have been circling around with the scouts to have their own fucking perspective, and this dude just walks in, punches the kid in the face, and takes all the papers away, and I was just like, what is going on here? And then there's police helping him.
There are multiple instances of assault in this movie, and nobody gets arrested. Jimmy Stewart legitimately punches like a dozen people, a dozen reporters after the reporting. That might actually be my favorite sequence in the movie in some ways, because I love the idea that Jimmy Stewart is presenting himself as this bright-eyed, naive guy, and the press is like already just sinking their teeth into him and making him come across like this money hungry politician. I mean, it's a perfect representation of what the media does. And unfortunately, as somebody with a journalism degree, I'm all too familiar with seeing this. And, we see this on social media all the time. And it's not even the mainstream media that really has to do it anymore, because you see it all the time on Twitter, all the time on Instagram and other social media platforms, just taking something, running with it, whether it's true or not.
Yeah, that's where the whole view never changes comes in. And I joke that this is a horror movie as it grows in age, but I don't know. By the end of the movie, I was kind of horrified, to be honest. Like, oh my god, like nothing's changed in 85 years, and it's getting worse. And all these negative thoughts went through my head about politics and U.S. government stuff. But I guess that's the point. So,
I mean, as it should. I mean, you should have negative thoughts about politicians after watching this movie. I don't understand how you couldn't at this point, given what we've seen, given what we know, given the way the politics are covered. I mean, there is a very specific reason that we are doing this movie this week, because it was my idea to kind of do 1939, and starting off with this, it felt only natural, because just it is of course election day around that time. So I was like, of course, this is the movie that I absolutely want us to review, even though if you look at the order in which they are released, this came out in October of 1939, so it definitely came out much later than some of the other movies that we will be discussing this month.
But it's very timely considering that every first week in November, it's voting season, so it's kind of perfect the way he kind of released this, I think, or at least Warner or Columbia Pictures did.
It's weird. Like as much as it's as much as the Wizard of Oz gets associated with Thanksgiving, and even the prequel Wicked is going to be coming out the week before Thanksgiving. Like, that was an August release. Like, it's so weird. I don't know if they cared as much about release dates, but based on looking at it, only Angels have Wings, which seemed to be like a quote unquote big summer release, because that came out in May of 1930.
For sure. And I guess we can kind of transition to the match, but I guess final thoughts. I think this movie is very good. Scares the shit out of me in the end. It may not scare you at the end, folks, but man, reality checks came in. Believe me.
I guess I'm so cynical that there's almost like nothing that could scare me. That's kind of how I feel about it. For me, I think that this is a movie that is one of Frank Capra's best, and I think that says a lot, because I do think very highly of It Happened One Night, which is a movie that we probably should review at some point because it's really, really good. And I mean, It's a Wonderful Life is a classic in its own right. This to me is right up there with those two movies in terms of the quality. I think it might falter a little bit in the end, and I don't think it's as snappy as It Happened One Night. I don't think it has the emotional heft of It's a Wonderful Life, but it is well worth watching, especially at this time of year. This is an excellent entry into 1939, and I am so excited for the other movies that we are going to be reviewing. But yeah, let's turn the dial down a little bit. Let's talk about Starrcade 1999, Bret Hart versus Goldberg. This is Vince Russo's big idea. 3 months of build, leading into a reformation of the NWO, which doesn't happen on this show, but it does happen on Nitro the next night. We have a revisiting of the Montreal Screwjob with Bret Hart defeating Goldberg. This is not Bret Hart's last match, but it is his last pay-per-view match until WrestleMania 26. Goldberg infamously was quite careless with Bret Hart, gave him a concussion. This started a string of concussions for Bret Hart, which ultimately ended his career and sent him on a personal spiral. What a terrible year for Bret Hart. Just one of the worst years ever. Not a great year for Goldberg. Not a good match at all.
Yeah, it's so disappointing because they actually started building this up earlier in the year before Owen died. And I don't know if you remember the angle, folks, but it was a great angle where he called Goldberg to the ring, and he's like, "Come on, let's go!" And then Goldberg spears him, but Goldberg gets knocked out. Everyone's like, "What's going on?" And then Bret reveals that metal chest plate, like in Back to the Future too. And I'm just thinking, like, holy shit! I remember that being a big deal because everyone thought that was a cool angle at the time. And '99 WCW, you're not getting a lot of cool angles like that, right? And then Owen passes away. Bret goes away for a while, comes back. You have to push him as a babyface. You can't just make him a heel again after what happens with Owen. So they're kind of stuck now because they wanted to build the Goldberg-Bret match. And then in the midst of this, Vince Russo comes in and takes over and takes power in like September-ish, October-ish, 99, whatever. And it just even messes things up even more. So now you got this dynamic of Bret Hart as a face carrying the company belt. And then you got Goldberg, the number two baby, or maybe even the number one babyface more than Bret Hart at the time. And, he's been chasing the gold since Starrcade the previous year. So it's like you book yourself into a corner and you have no choice but to book this match. So it sucks because there's not as much heat because they did this thing where they were buddy building up to the pay-per-view.
They were literally the WCW Tag Team Champions in the build-up to this.
Which WWE would graciously rip off so many times years later and so many times with different people.
I mean, Vince Russo did it in the WWF multiple times.
And then we got it years later with like Ray and Batista, I remember, did the gimmick. John Cena and Shawn Michaels did the gimmick.
Yeah, I mean, just the way the tag team titles in the WWE and even WCW have been treated, just terrific.
For sure. And then that's kind of the build-up in the background to this match. And then Bret wins the title the pay-per-view before. In that giant stupid tournament, which I don't even think Goldberg got in, which is, whatever.
No, because Goldberg was feuding with Sid at that point, and the big match at Mayhem was kind of a 5-minute submission match.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Because the run before was like the Sid bleeding out match, which was actually kind of good. But, yeah, and Goldberg was just on this run of like screwy finishes as well, because at Halloween Havoc, they did the first time that Hogan does the job laying down. He lays down for Sting, and everyone's confused. Yes. And then Sting goes on the end of the pay-per-view and calls anyone out, calls out Goldberg. They have a match. Goldberg wins, and Goldberg thinks he's the champion. But then the next night, it's like, who's the champion?
I mean, the idea was that Goldberg basically won the United States title and the WCW title in one night, and then they strip him of the WCW title, and he loses the U.S. title to Scott Hall the next night. Just really embarrassing stuff, just the worst, the drizzling shits. And then you come to this match, and you end up with a match that is really, really bad, like just shockingly awful. And it sucks to me because, like, this is, of course, like Bret Hart's last major match, and to have it just not be very good. And I mean, the thing is, like, Bret Hart is able to have good matches with not great workers. I mean, I would say that, you look at what he did with Kevin Nash, a miracle worker. And look, it's a few years later. Bret Hart's older, maybe doesn't care as much. Brian brought up a really good point before we started recording that he didn't even come out with a jacket on the show for the biggest WCW pay-per-view of the year. So maybe that just kind of shows what Bret Hart's mentality was. But it just sucks, man. It really sucks that we get this just total lack of caring on Bret Hart's part. Not that I blame him one bit. And then you end up with just a match that is just not very good. Like, it's not very well executed. Goldberg is always pretty sloppy. And again, I guess Bret Hart was not the person to bring out the best in him. I mean, you compare this to what Diamond Dallas Page did with him a year earlier at Halloween Havoc. I mean, it's so much better. But I mean, the thing is, again, Goldberg is not the type of guy that you expect great matches from. But for something like this, when you compound it with Roddy Piper coming out as a referee and screwing Goldberg and calling for the bell, it's really stupid.
Considering that it's not even Montreal, where it's like, if you were in Montreal, it's like, yeah, sure, Bret Hart, fuck it, whatever. But they're in Washington, which has no history to that finish whatsoever. So it's just like, oh, we're going to do the finish because Vince Russo is back, and everyone knows Vince Russo's in WCW now, so there's got to be some kind of screw job, right? So, again, there's this other idea of the connections between the match and the movie. It's this idea that Bret gets screwed over a lot. And I couldn't help but think when Jimmy Stewart's on the filibuster on the Senate floor, I couldn't help but think of the Raw promo after he loses the title match to Sid and they're bringing the cage down and he's yelling at McMahon. I couldn't help but think like it's like the
I
same
can see that. I can see
mojo
that.
because he's so angry and he got screwed over and he's like, I looked up to you, Vince, like a father, right? And that's the same thing with Jefferson. Like he looked up to Claude Rains as a father figure.
Bret
So
Hart is the naive person who was brought down by the wrestling business, and Jefferson Smith is a naive person who
I
was
know.
brought down by politics. There is absolutely a connection to be made between them, and it's good that we
And
are able to
then
do
it
that.
happens all over again in WCW because you got to think him going there with all the money they paid him that he's just going to go and be a main event, and they didn't book him like a main event at all until this moment.
I mean,
So it's like,
they basically turned him heel like 3 months into his run. I mean, the problem is nobody wanted to work with him. Nobody wanted a job to him on that level, and he just ended up with this awful run, this awful mediocre run. I mean, really, the only good match that Bret Hart had in WCW, like the real only classic that he had, was a match that basically it doesn't exist in the canon of pro wrestling now because it was against Chris Benoit. So people are never going to want to watch that. And really, there is no other great Bret Hart match. I mean, the Ric Flair match that sold out was decent, but there's no Steve Austin at WrestleMania 13 or even Diesel at King of the Ring and Royal Rumble 95.
you almost got that level with Booker T. I wanted more of the Bret Booker T stuff, but they just didn't know what to do.
Nope.
Should Booker be feuding with Stevie Ray? Should he be feuding with Booker? Or should he be feuding with Bret? Or he should be feuding with Scott Hall randomly? It's like, come on. The answer was Bret, clearly, and then just do Stevie Ray later with that whole thing. But they just pushed him because of that. So it's frustrating because Booker T was so like on this upper, like he was climbing. He gets hurt right when he has this match with Bret Hart in '98, and then he comes back and his momentum is like stagnant until they force the belt on him in 2000. But man, I don't know. Booker was like on the rise, and Bret could have been there to help him rise, but the timing and the injuries, and Bret got hurt too. So it's crazy to think that like Goldberg and DDP is like the better match than Goldberg and Bret. And
Well, the thing is,
crazy.
they could never decide how much they wanted to push Booker T, and that is a whole other story. Just how Booker T was treated in WCW, and I think people really like to glamorize it, but I mean, really, until the dying days, Booker T was kind of regarded as a second-class citizen, and I'm using I'm using that terminology for a specific reason because it's absolutely true.
Yeah, that's a whole other discussion too, man. But Booker T in '98 was so good until he got hurt. He's one of the highlights of me on that because I was on again like on a Nitro run, and TV matches with Booker T in '98 were just so like on point and ended so well. So yeah, he's super underrated around that time, I think, and got stagnant for 2 years because of what happened. But I just, and if you look at the story of this match, it's clear like they should have just did like Goldberg's got a hurt leg and just that's the story and just but they had to do the Goldberg stuff, right? Where they had to do these spots and he's got to do these power spots. So it just didn't mesh with the
Because
story that they were
Goldberg
trying
is
to
so
tell.
limited. I mean, that's the problem is that Goldberg is very limited. And again, Bret Hart is usually able to kind of get more out of these bigger guys who do have limited movesets. But I mean, it did not click in this case. I mean, go watch Bret Hart and Diesel from Royal Rumble 95 or Survivor Series 95, and you will think that Kevin Nash is one of the all-time great workers if you watch. And it's all
Wow.
Bret Hart.
Yeah, that makes I can see that because those matches are incredible. And Nash can only the other match that I can think of is the one with HBK, but again, that's
Shocking.
another in-ring general. So yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. And you can tell that like he's just so unmotivated and it sucks. And even the promo, like before he goes out to the curtain is just so uninspired. I'm just like, man. But the crowd's still into the Goldberg entrance, so I guess that's what they had going for him. But just this idea of we gotta have a no finish and just not explain things to the audience. It's like, oh, that'll increase the ratings for tomorrow night because everyone's gonna tune in wondering what's going on. But in reality, it kind of turned people away.
Spoiler alert, it did not.
It turned people away, and this is where like WWF started just become the thing, and that's kind of unfortunate, man. And then a month later, Bret's done in his full-time career, so. That's kind of the story.
He has a hardcore match with Terry Funk, and that's it. He's done.
Yeah, and he actually gets kicked in the head twice in this match too. I forget about the first kick, which
there was also
looked okay.
the fact that Goldberg,
but it was the roundhouse kick that did it. So
Yep, and Goldberg didn't catch him on the figure 4 attempt either. That is also a moment.
Oh yeah, and then Bret just kind of hit his back fucking hard on the concrete. So yeah, and that's one of the specialties too, and that he's done so many times, but it just didn't. He didn't hit the move properly. So again, just Bret not on his game.
Yeah, it's really dumb, everyone. It's not great. So yeah, that is our conversation on Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and Bret Hart and Goldberg having a really terrible match. Also in Washington, and you can make up your own mind which was the bigger disaster. Anyway, Brian, next week we are going to be talking about Only Angels Have Wings. I have not seen this movie before, Brian, but in looking at the best movies of 1939, this feels like one we have to get to. We have never talked about Cary Grant, and that's something I feel like we need to do.
Well, I love Cary Grant in North by Northwest like a lot. I think that's my favorite performance. I've seen him in at least in a Hitchcock movie. I know there's like Suspicion, I believe, or Rebecca, or one of those where he's kind of like Shadow of a Doubt, maybe, where he plays this guy who you think he's trying to kill his wife, but he's not really trying to kill his wife. And at the end of the movie, you think he's actually trying to kill his wife, and you don't find out. So that's a really good one. But I think Cary Grant has this strange magnetic charisma where he can just like be so charming and insult you at the same time in the same tone of voice. And I think he's got a talent for that. And anytime there's like a new Cary Grant movie I haven't seen before that, I'm down to watch, because he's got this magnetic charisma that just he can insult you in the most kind way.
Yeah, very much looking forward to that. Again, 2 weeks from now, Stagecoach. And of course, why wouldn't we discuss The Wizard of Oz during Thanksgiving week? For Brian, I am Jerome. Thank you so much for listening. We will talk to you again next week.